Well, thank you all for coming. And before I get into the presentation, as many of you know, my wife passed away last month, and I really want to thank the museum for all the support. It was overwhelming, and really thank you for that. Now, the title of this talk is If Only They Could Talk. Because we've all been to museums, we've all looked at items and said, gee, if we just knew the history of that, if only they could talk. Well, the items I brought from my collection, I do know the stories of, in most cases. Some of them talk, some of them scream, some of them just whisper, and at least one chuckles. So we'll talk about these. One of the reasons I like to give this talk is because it really represents what this museum is all about. Even though this is my collection, one of the reasons I got interested in the museum was because it was a museum of stories, not just of stuff. My collection is basically the same thing. So it was somewhat a natural fit for me. I am dressed in the uniform of a major of Union infantry. Now, the uniform is a reproduction, with some exceptions. Now, I used to dress as a captain of Union infantry, and then for some reason, that uniform shrank. And I was not able to replace it quickly. The only thing I could get was a major's uniform, so I promoted myself. This hat insignia and this belt buckle were both worn by Captain Ezra Day Dickerman of the 20th Connecticut Infantry, who fought at Gettysburg, among other places. The insignia, with the hunting horn, was the insignia of infantry during the Civil War period. The crossed muskets that we now associate with infantry did not come in until the 1870s. This insignia was copied from the French insignia for light infantry. And when you think about it, the whole uniform is French-inspired. The long frock coat, in this case, the képi or forage cap. Think about Charles de Gaulle. We had, I think, an identity crisis as far as military uniforms was concerned. We started off copying the British/French. They all looked alike, basically, during the Revolutionary War. Up through the War of 1812, it was pretty much British-French inspired. Up through the Civil War, it was still French inspired. And then in 1871, the French lost a war. They lost it to the Prussians. So all of a sudden, we started copying the Prussians. It wasn't until the Spanish-American War that we got our own identity back, and then lost it again during World War I, when we basically wore British-style uniforms. Again, this is French-inspired. The saber I'm wearing, or sword actually I'm wearing, was actually carried by a captain, George Gregory Stanbro, of the 116th New York Infantry. Get tangled up in these modern things here. Interesting history on Captain Stanbro. Before the war, he was studying to be a doctor. And in that time period, the way you studied to be a doctor was you found a doctor and you studied under him. When the war broke out, the man he was studying under decided to go to war and raised a company of infantry. It quite often happened in that early part of the war when a prominent citizen raised a company, they made themselves captain. And then he made his apprentice, if you will, a lieutenant. Now the captain fairly quickly resigned his commission, probably figuring out you could get hurt doing that kind of stuff. And the lieutenant then became promoted captain. During the fighting around Port Hudson, Louisiana, in May 28th, I believe it was, of 1863, then Captain Stambro was leading a charge. While doing that, a bullet went through his scabbard. You can see where it's been repaired. Shortly after that, he decided to resign his commission. Now, that sounds funny, and I've read quite a few resignations. I read one. I used to have a pistol belonging to a guy in the Missouri Cavalry Regiment who spent a whole page justifying his resignation. His colonel then endorsed it with one word: incompetent. This man, his resignation, I thought, was very well put. He said, "I would like to resign my commission as a captain of infantry to make room for someone more qualified than I. And I will then transfer my service to the medical corps for which I have been trained." And he then became a doctor in the Army Hospital at Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where he met his future wife. So to me, that was a very legitimate resignation. This hat was worn by this man who served in the, I gotta cheat on here a little bit, 149th New York. His name was Captain Oliver L.F. Brown. And the 149th served with both the 12th and the 20th Corps and participated, among other things, in the March to the Sea, Sheridan's March to the Sea in '63. Interesting thing about Brown is I looked him up on the internet and found a picture. And I thought, gee whiz, this isn't the same guy, because he had a full head of hair. Then I looked at it real close. He was wearing a toupee. We had the same barber. This is how he really looked. But to get his picture taken, he had a toupee on. Now, we'll find another example of vanity as we go along. This canteen, carried by a Union soldier, Thomas V. Gleason, Company I of the 42nd Massachusetts. Company I of the 42nd Massachusetts had the misfortune to be landed on a pier in Galveston Harbor to support a battery of Union artillery, and left there too long. The Confederates attacked, captured them. Gleason ended up in a Confederate prison camp and stayed there for quite a while until he was eventually exchanged and returned to the Union Army. This is a Confederate canteen. It is marked J.D. Fielder, and my research, which I hope is correct, has indicated that he was a member of the 3rd Battalion, Missouri Cavalry, and fought in places like Iuka, Corinth, and various places in the West. Now remember, when I talk about the West, I'm not talking about Colorado. I'm talking about west of the Alleghenies. Basically, the Mississippi Valley on both sides. There was action in the far west. As you know, if you've gone through the museum, Colorado actually had troops in the Civil War. One of them, the 1st Colorado, fought at the battles of Glorieta, New Mexico, Apache Canyon, New Mexico, and Peralta, New Mexico. Peralta is down near Albuquerque. Peralta was the scene of the last battle among the Confederates in New Mexico, and it forced them to flee down, or retreat rather, down the west side of the Rio Grande to El Paso. Now that was a very arduous retreat because the west side of the Rio Grande is all mountains. Find out where I am here. The owner of this pistol, Spruce McCoy Baird, retreated with the Confederate Army down the west side of the Rio Grande, along with his family. Spruce McCoy Baird, sort of a funny history, he grew up in Kentucky, where he really liked the daughter of people that lived up on the hill. He did not live up on the hill. He was basically on the wrong side of the tracks, if there had been tracks at that time. The parents of his intended did not think much of him. So he went west, down into Texas, where he was studying to be a lawyer. At some point, he came back and spirited away his intended. During the Mexican War, he fought for the Texas Infantry, and after the war was awarded the judgeship of Santa Fe County, Texas, for his participation in the war with Mexico. Anybody know where Santa Fe County, Texas is? That's because you heard me speak before. You don't count. You are sitting in Santa Fe County, Texas. It was a land claim. Texans always think big. My wife was a Texan, so I know from where I speak. But anyway, the Texans had a land claim that ran all the way up the Front Range to southern Wyoming. That was settled by the U.S. government when Texas became a state for $100,000. So when Spruce McCoy Baird ended up in Santa Fe saying, "I am the judge," they said, "Like hell you are." But he stayed in Santa Fe, or in New Mexico, had a ranch in Albuquerque, where he, in 1860, became the Attorney General of New Mexico. But when the Texans came through to invade New Mexico, Colorado, etc., in 1862, he joined with the Confederacy. And they actually camped on his ranch in Albuquerque. This is a picture of him taken after the war. This drawing came out of a book called Rebels on the Rio Grande, which was the edited diary of a member of the 4th Texas Mounted Infantry, a man named Alfred Petticolas. If you have a chance and interested in that campaign, I would suggest you try to find a copy of that. because it is a first-hand report of what happened from a Confederate soldier standpoint. He makes one comment Petticolas does in his diary, I guess you'd call it, that they were really surprised because they thought they were just going to fight regulars. And the regulars had not had a real good reputation at that point in New Mexico. But he says instead of fighting the regulars, we fought those damn Pikes Peakers. And of course he's talking about the Coloradoans. After the war, Spruce McCoy Baird became a circuit riding lawyer with offices both in Trinidad and Golden, Colorado. And at some point, and I don't know quite when, he got the revolver and altered, I believe, his military holster to become a more traditional Western-style holster. You don't ride around Trinidad, northern New Mexico in the 1860s without packing a gun. I bought this from his granddaughter. Another story with a revolver involved. This is a Colt 36 caliber, the so-called Navy, which doesn't mean the Navy used them exclusively. This one, and it came with this holster, has an intriguing inscription on the butt. It says, Upperville, Virginia, June the 21st, I think it is, 1863. The Battle of Upperville was the third and last of the cavalry battles that preceded the Battle of Gettysburg. It was technically a Union victory in that they pushed the Confederates, Stuart's cavalry, back up to the crest of the Blue Ridge. Questionable victory because Stuart, at that point, Stuart was operating very efficiently, and the whole purpose was to keep the Union from crossing the Blue Ridge to see what the infantry, Confederate infantry, was doing. But it was a Union victory in that they controlled the battlefield. The troops involved were, of course, Stuart's cavalry, a brigade of Union cavalry commanded by John Buford, who opened the ball, if you will, at the Battle of Gettysburg, and a brigade of infantry, which included the 20th Maine, which fought, as you may know, at Little Round Top. So everybody involved in that battle at Upperville ended up fighting at Gettysburg. What the significance is of the inscription, I can only guess at. My feeling is that whoever had the gun thought that the battle was significant. He didn't put his name on it because he knew who he was, but he thought the battle was significant probably because that's where he captured the pistol. Again, that's supposition, so this is mainly a whisper because I'm just sort of guessing at the history, but it seems plausible to me. This is what's called a lady's hair locket. It has a picture of a Confederate lieutenant on it, and when you flip it over, it's got a lock of hair, presumably the lieutenant's hair. Again, a little bit of guesswork here, but I believe it's a man named Elder who served in the 28th Virginia. This is sometimes called a mourning locket because the lock of hair represents someone who's passed away. I have no idea whether that happened to Lieutenant Elder. Unfortunately, Confederate records are not very complete. I know a man named John Elder served in the 28th Virginia. I don't know what happened to him or anything else. This could be a mourning locket, or it could simply be a hair locket. One of the, get away from guns a little bit. Lots of people ask me, well, what's the most valuable thing in your collection? I have no idea, because as far as I'm concerned, monetary value is not important. It is the historic value that is important to me. And one of the more valuable historic items I have, which really isn't worth very much money, is this little book. This book is Cowper's or Cooper's Book of Poems, published in 1846. The inscription here, and I'm paraphrasing it a little bit, but it says, "This book was presented to me by my beloved husband on the anniversary of our marriage," and I forget the date, but it's 1849. Signed, Philippa Field. If you turn that over, in an entirely different handwriting, it says, "This book was taken by me from the dead body of a Confederate soldier during the Battle of Gettysburg, F.G. Patterson, 5th Maine Volunteers." So, Philippa Field gave the book back to her husband to take with him as a keepsake when he fought for the Confederacy, and he was killed at the Battle of Gettysburg. Interesting thing about Cooper's Book of Poems, I have since learned that he was noted for his anti-slavery poetry. So, whether or not this book contains anti-slavery poetry, I don't know, but that's what he was noted for, and it seems interesting that that would have been given to a Southern family, which brings up a point. We tend to put people in categories. Not everybody in the South believed in slavery. Not everybody in the South believed in separation from the Union. Not everybody in the North believed in abolition. There were people believing every different things. A Union general by the name of Sheridan believed in preserving the Union, but if he had had his way, after the war, everything would have gone back to the way it was before, including slavery. So we tend to put labels on people, and those labels are quite often not correct. This pistol, I forgot. This pistol, also a Colt Navy, and this holster all belong to this man. This is his enlistment papers. His name was Cornelius Barnhart. He, although he was from North Carolina, he enlisted in the 1st South Carolina Regulars. Now, it turns out South Carolina had 3 1st South Carolina units, which led to some confusion. So they renamed the 1st South Carolina Regulars as the 3rd South Carolina Heavy Artillery. Now, if you've always been the first of something, you don't want to be known as the 3rd of anything. So, in a lot of the official documents, they keep referring to themselves as the 1st South Carolina Regulars. However, they were heavy artillery, and they manned the defenses around Charleston Harbor. One company, and I don't believe he was in it, but one company actually manned some of the artillery on Morris Island. If you've ever seen the movie Glory, and I know we've shown it here several times, the last battle in that movie concerned the attack on Battery Wagner or Fort Wagner on Morris Island. This man may have been there, but at the very least, he was at the batteries surrounding Charleston Harbor and undoubtedly fired not only on the Navy, which was supporting that attack, but possibly on the infantry on Morris Island itself. As long as we're talking about the Battle of Fort Wagner, this man was there. The Second Lieutenant James H. Barrett, 48th New York Volunteer Infantry. This is his pistol, and you can't see it from there, but if you were to come up and look at it, you'll see a dent in the frame here, and that this part of the loading lever has been repaired/replaced. This is his sword, no scabbard. When I bought this, and I gotta have a little water here, excuse me. When I bought this, another man was trying to buy it. And he did what a lot of people do. He pointed out to the seller everything that was wrong with the gun and sword. No scabbard for the sword, a dent in the frame, loading lever had been repaired, and then, but I'll still take it off your hands. Fortunately, he was not successful. I was. The next business day, I hot-footed it down to the Denver Public Library, and I looked up James H. Barrett, excuse me. And I first looked in the Adjutant General's report for the state of New York. I found him, but of course that didn't tell me anything. All I found out was that he was real, which I suspected he was. There were over 300 regiments, New York regiments, and the Denver Library had 30 regimental histories. Odds were not good. However, I did find a regimental history on the 48th New York. I did not steal this one from the library. Yeah. But I'm looking through their copy. And the first thing I found was on the chapter that dealt with the attack on Fort Wagner, I found a comment by the author of the book that said he was on detached duty. The following report is written by Second Lieutenant James A. Barrett, Company H, 48th New York. My guy. In part, this says, I have Civil War eyes. We lay on our arms all day, and just before dusk were formed in column of companies and advanced under a galling fire up the beach. It was a trying hour, our ranks thinning at every step. For part of the way, the right of our column was forced to wade in the water. On our left, another column, composed of the 54th Massachusetts Colored Regiment under the command of Colonel Shaw also advanced on the fort. If you've seen the movie is actually backwards. They're advancing on the wrong side of the island, which of course doesn't make any difference, but this clears up where they were. I think at the point, and when I bought this was right after the movie Glory came out. I think at this point where I read about the 54th Massachusetts is when the librarian asked me to quit screaming and dancing on the table. I didn't. We waded the moat and scaled the parapet. Our losses were terrible, sometimes whole companies being mowed down at once. We jumped over the parapet and into one of the bastions where there were 2 guns, but the firing was so heavy that the firing was so heavy that it could not turn them to any use. Darkness was upon us, and we could see nothing. The supporting columns coming up in our rear mistook us for the rebels and fired into us. Our killed and wounded kept piling up. A retreat was ordered, but was not altogether understood, and some 50 of us remained and continued firing. I was severely wounded in the thigh, but roused myself and directed the fire of these few men as best I could, collecting ammunition from the dead and wounded. When this gave out, I ordered all who could to go to the rear. This section of the fort was literally filled with dead and wounded, piled up even with the parapet. I crossed over the parapet, over their bodies, slid down the side, and crossed the moat, which was full of our dead and wounded. My sword scabbard had been shot away, my pistol bent and useless, which explains no scabbard and the repair to the pistol. Those are the type of stories that I just thrive on. Those are the things that make history living. And again, that's what this museum is all about. We have stories that make history alive. They're stories of people, real people, that experienced various things during our history. As some of you know, I served in the Navy during the Korean War, and the last ship I served on was called the Uss Panola. It was a seagoing tug. But it was the third ship of that name. The first ship of that name was a Civil War gunboat. That was one of the 2 gunboats that Farragut sent up the Mississippi to cut the booms between Fort Jackson and St. Philip so he could proceed up the Mississippi and capture New Orleans. This is a picture of Lieutenant Commander A.P. Cook, who was the executive officer on the first USS Panola when they went up the river. And this is his telescope. Let's see what I haven't talked about yet. Oh, I move over here for a little bit. This revolver is associated with these three men. Their last name, all three of them, is Foote. The revolver is engraved in three places: on the butt, in what I call engraving style number 1, it says Captain John Foote. And in what I call engraving style number 3, it says died 1862, 2nd Minnesota Infantry, and gave the battle where he served, which was Mill Springs, Kentucky. On the back strap, in what I call engraving style number 2, it says S.C. Foote, and then in engraving style number 3, U.S. Volunteer Navy, USS Stars and Stripes, and the campaigns that the Stars and Stripes were in. In this area, in the 3rd engraving style, it says Captain Alfred Foote, 14th U.S., which means regulars, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, Weldon Railroad, which was part of the siege of Petersburg, and several others. I could never put them all together. John Foote was easy. 2nd Minnesota. Came from, enlisted in, his name escapes me right now, but in Minnesota. S.C. Foote, the sailor, was impossible to find because the Navy did not keep general records at that time. It was more by ship than anything else. The third man, Alfred Foote, I found in the 14th Regulars, but he was from New York. Couldn't figure out how to put them all together. Now, I know some people at the museum will argue about this, but I can turn on a computer. And sometimes I can turn it off without a problem. I had asked several people who knew more about computers than I to try to figure this out, and nobody could. One day, on a whim, I Googled John Foote and came up with a book called The Memorial of John Foote, written by his father, whose name was Alfred Samuel Foote. The other two names. I got a copy of that book in which the father writes about John Foote, about him dying of probably tuberculosis because the family came from New York State. But John had developed a very bad cough and moved west, where he got better and moved to Minnesota. Now, he went, I think it was Grand Rapids, where the Red Wing Boot Company is. Another, probably cousin, named Benjamin Foote, started the tannery that supplied leather to the future Red Wing Boot Company. When the war started, John joined the 2nd Minnesota, fought at Mill Springs, Kentucky, and then died probably of tuberculosis at his home in Genesee, New York. And according to the father, in the arms of his brother Alfred. So now I've got 2 of them. And he also says that his son Samuel joined the Navy. So figuring I was on a roll, I went ahead and put in the father's name. And it turned out the father wrote an autobiography in which these 3 pictures were, and mentions, I'd always wondered about the name Foote. The 2nd Admiral of the U.S. Navy was Andrew Foote, but he spelled his name different. He had an E on the end of it. And I thought, gee, it'd be neat if they were associated. When the father in his autobiography says his son Samuel Foote joined the U.S. Volunteer Navy and got his commission from his cousin, Admiral Andrew Foote. So all of a sudden, everybody ties together. And I have not used the computer since. I figured I used up all my luck that time. Some screams. This is a cartridge box plate that was worn on the cartridge box on the right hip. You can see where a bullet has gone in here. Don't know the fate of the wearer. I can speculate on the fate of this man. This is a infantryman's belt buckle with a notch in it. This one did not stop a bullet. This was found at the Stone River battlefield, Murfreesboro, Tennessee. This Union soldier, I can't imagine, survived. This belt buckle, similar to this one, but concave rather than convex like this one is, has been hit by a bullet here. You can see the indentation here. And the tongue is broken off from the force of the bullet. This did save somebody's life. This is what's called a Confederate frame belt buckle. This was the most common Confederate buckle. All the things you see in the movie and the pictures where the Confederates are wearing an oval CS buckle. Yes, there were some, but they were rather rare. This type of buckle was much more common. Something pretty interesting about this buckle. It was never unbuckled. 2 pieces of leather are still attached. When I got it, a spent percussion cap from a pistol fell out of it. Whoever was wearing this had been firing a pistol. I guess there are other explanations of why it wasn't unbuckled, but the most obvious one was the owner was not able to. So that's a scream. I did promise a chuckle. This man, John Franklin Powell, 18 years old. I looked at this picture and I thought, he's not 18. Got this great big mustache. This guy's about 23. Then I looked at it very carefully. The mustache was painted on. He apparently was trying to grow one. Had his picture taken to impress the girls back home, and when the Mustache didn't show up in the picture, had the artist paint one on. So that's a chuckle. The last thing I'd like to point out is this sword. I generally am not interested in fancy stuff. This is what I call a dancing sword, not a battle sword. But there's an exception to this one. On the scabbard, this silver plaque says, "Presented by the loyal citizens of Bethlehem to Captain William H. Stolzenbach, Company C, 46th Regiment, PVV, which stands for Pennsylvania Veteran Volunteers. Honor the Brave, Atlanta, 1864. The irony on this is that it was presented to Captain Stolzenbach. He could no longer use it because he had lost his right hand at the Battle of Atlanta. I have since found a mention in the local newspaper called the Moravian that mentions the presentation of the sword. Captain Stolzenbach survived the war only to drown, swimming in the Atlantic Ocean off Atlantic City. I believe it was 76, I'm not certain about the date. Swimming in the ocean with only one hand is probably not a very safe thing. One wonders if possibly it wasn't a suicide. The last three things I'll talk about. This pipe, which you can look at closer, is nicely carved with the man's name, John Brock. He was in the 27th Illinois. This is his picture. And this is a box that he carried his presumably official papers in, which he has inletted with a patriotic motif. I brought 2 muskets simply because everything else was quite light, and being a masochist, I had to bring something heavy. This is what's commonly called an 1861 Springfield, although it was made by a contractor, not by Springfield. And carved in it says 121 NYV with a red cross. Red Cross had nothing to do with medicine at that time. That was the corps insignia of the 6th Army Corps, the red designating 1st Division. If it was white, it would have been the 2nd Division, blue, 3rd Division. Turns out the man's name is carved in the barrel channel under here, and the man's name is George Wallace, not the future governor of, Alabama. He did fight at the Battle of Gettysburg. There is no reason to believe this gun was not there. The last item, this is an Enfield musket made in Great Britain, imported to the U.S. If you watch the Bad History Channel, you will believe that only the Confederates used these. Not correct. Actually, the North imported almost twice as many as the South did. And who knows how many of the ones the South imported got through the blockade. This was used by a man named Patrick Lynch, who carved his name sort of on the back. Turns out Patrick Lynch was illiterate, and probably somebody traced out what his name ought to be, and he carved it in there. He served in the 2nd New Jersey Infantry, and during the Second Battle of Bull Run, the 2nd New Jersey was sent to chase the Confederate cavalry out of Manassas Junction. Well, when they got there to chase out the cavalry, it turns out that Stonewall Jackson's entire division was there. And when the 2nd New Jersey and the rest of its brigade advanced, and all of a sudden this division came out of the woods, I got to think Patrick Lynch thought, this is no place for Mother Lynch's little boy, because he was wounded during that battle. He lost his trigger finger. Now, that may be legitimate, or it also could have been time to go home. Boom. Don't know. And I'm really not making fun of him, because I don't know what I would have done in that situation. I've never been in combat, and I think it's wrong for people to make a judgment on someone that has been. One item I forgot to mention the complete story on, Cornelius Barnhart, this man, in 1864 ended up in a hospital in Savannah, Georgia. Now, I showed you his enlistment papers. He does not have any discharge papers, because in November, I guess it was, of 64, when he was in the hospital in Savannah, he heard the tramp, tramp, tramp of Sherman's boys coming. Decided it was time to go back to the farm and left. Again, I'm not criticizing. I think it was probably a damn good idea. Those are my stories. Most of them true. I would certainly be open to any questions you might have. One question I'm usually asked is, how do you find this stuff? The answer is, I leave a trail of money and it follows me home. That's fairly accurate. You're welcome. First of all, I'll entertain any questions you might have. And secondly, you're welcome to come up after we're finished and look at these items. Any questions? Yes, sir.
I would just like to say, Bob, the research you've done on these items and many, many more that I realize you have is just amazing. Amazing job.
A lot of it's luck.
Bob, who's the guy in the oval picture over here to your right? The other side of that one.
This one.
I don't think you covered him, and I missed it.
Oh, that was the owner of this guy.
Oh, okay.
That was William Stolzenbach. Don't believe that's the sword. I think it looks like he's got both hands. I believe that picture was taken before he was wounded. Other questions? Well, just in closing, I would like to salute the memory of these people and all veterans from all wars. Thank you.
You know, I've seen this presentation before, but it's always different.
Yeah, and the stories were probably different.
Most of the stories are true, right?
I get bored with the same stories.
So, I encourage everybody to, if you have time, to come upstairs and see some of our new exhibits. We've got Lou Roman back there. He's our exhibit guy. Boy, in fact, the other day just said, I got to walk through. There's a lot of changes here, and I'm here all the time. So you'll enjoy going there.